Welcome to the Mindful Leadership Podcast. How do we navigate through all the noise, distractions, and pressures to make thoughtful, conscious decisions that are better for us, our people, our customers, and our organizations? How do we know if we're busy and effective or just too busy to be effective? In this podcast, we talk to leaders who share their stories about challenging existing paradigms and doing different things differently. I'm your host, Shahana Banerjee, founder and CEO of Just Human, Not Resources, on a mission to humanize the future of work. In this episode, we talk to my good friend and perennial sounding board, Josh Ghaim. He is the CEO of Ignite Venture Studio, innovator and inventor, and a well-loved leader and mentor to many. I'm so delighted and beyond thrilled today to have Josh join us for this podcast. He is our first guest and on our first podcast. So welcome, Josh.
Thank you for having me, Shahana. It's great to be with you. And I'm really excited. It's pretty cool that you launched this new podcast.
Yeah, well, neither of us know where this is going to go. So we'll find out together. But thanks for taking a chance.
I'm a perfect person to experiment with.
Well, let's dive right in. So, Josh, you've had an amazing career. Tell us a little bit about your story, your growing up years, and the journey that got you to where you are today.
It's a long story, but I think to start with, I'm originally from Eritrea. And for people that are not familiar with Eritrea, it's in East Africa, right by the Red Sea. So both my parents, I was born there. You search Eritrea, the first thing you're going to see is like a 30-year war with Ethiopia. So that's basically where I was born, in the middle of that war. My mom was in the healthcare space. My dad was basically in orphanages, building schools. He was running some school programs in Eritrea. But then after the war, there was a famine in Ethiopia. So a lot of people started to move to Sudan. So we ended up actually moving to Sudan, where my mom worked for the Swiss Red Cross and my dad worked for different relief organizations, which almost, I would say, till this day, pretty much shapes everything of how you look at things. So when I was a kid in Eritrea, in Sudan, we went to school. Whenever we were not at school, we're usually either at the refugee camp where my mom worked, which is basically most clinics, or we're traveling with my dad to another refugee camp where people have settled there. And myself and my brothers used to just volunteer, whether it's translating to some of the physicians that would work with my mom, or in some cases, distributing food, register people. Because when you get exposed to that when you're 5, 6, 7 years old, you just look at the world in a very different way. So was that background. We moved around quite a bit in terms of how we grew up, except my parents were always very strict about school. There was math, science. It's like any immigrant families. It's regardless of where you come, that's going to be always the priority. But after I finished high school, actually, my parents basically said, time to go to US. And that's how we ended up in the US. So I ended up moving to Indiana, which is basically, I did about 3 months of high school there and then started college almost immediately. But you can imagine the types of things you go through when you're a kid. But at the same time, it was probably one of the best decisions from a family perspective, from what my parents did, was my 3 brothers, to be able to come to US, get the education, and to get to where we are. So I did my undergrad in chemistry. I did my PhD at University of Illinois, because at that point, my thinking was that I was going to go into academic type research. And at the same time, while I was in grad school, I was actually coaching the women's soccer team at University of Illinois. But that's an area that I always focused on, because as much as you think in classrooms and jobs, you learn a lot. There's no better place to learn so many things in sports. When I got a call from Colgate, which was Colgate-Palmolive, the toothpaste company, I actually thought it was Colgate University to talk about soccer. So for probably about 15 minutes, it was just completely opposite. We had like 2 different topics of discussion. Finally, the guy said, "Oh, no, we're Colgate-Palmolive, the toothpaste company." And my first reaction was basically, why would I go work for a toothpaste company. But ended up going there actually, and it was probably one of the best decisions. It got me into a completely new industry that led to where I am today. I think there's a couple of things that I would say they shape everything I do now. Seeing a lot of kids that during the famine in Ethiopia, all the things in the refugee camps, it's almost like all what we call first world problems are like nothing relative to what people go through every day. So for me, I think that's almost how I measure everything. When people come to me and say, oh, I think this happened or that happened, I'm like, so what? It's like there's no, it's almost like there's this mentality like, what's the worst thing that could happen? If something fails, if something happens, relative to people that are dealing with all the issues, I mean, that they're suffering with for so many reasons. And then we think that having a job and like a product not being successful or something, it's like we think of it as the end of the world. And I'm like, okay, that's just, hey, what's the worst thing that could happen if something doesn't work or if you fail? What are the lessons that you learned? So that's the approach I take, and all my decisions are almost directed towards that. It's just night and day in terms of how we should be thinking about what our jobs do. And it's just an incredible opportunity to help people. So why not?
Yeah, absolutely. And then from Colgate, of course, your career, skyrocketed and took off. And now, you are the CEO of Ignite Venture Studios. So tell us more about that journey.
I think I'll start with Colgate, actually. I have to tell you, when I first got to Colgate, first, I have no idea about the industry. I was always in the academic type research labs. That's where I worked most of the time. When I got a job offer, I actually got 2 job offers at Colgate. Obviously, Colgate is known for their oral care business with toothpaste, and they had a personal care business. And I ended up getting 2 job offers from both of them. And I remember coming to visit. So I spoke to the guys that were in the oral care space, and they're like, hey, we're the guys that get funded. We're the focus of the company. And then when I spoke to the personal care people, they said, we're probably not going to get funded the same way that the oral care people, and I'm sure you're going to go there. I actually ended up choosing the personal care group. At that time, it was just a simple formula for me. If I joined the personal care group, there's only one person between me and the person in charge of the whole business. Whereas if I go over to the oral care, there's like 10 layers. I would never see the person that's actually in charge. And that's how I made my decision. It was probably one of the best decisions I ever made that set my career. And at that time, the VP of the category, he pulled me into his office and he said, you know what, I've been in this job for, 20 something years. He goes, people are going to tell you, it's like, you're going to worry about when are you getting promoted? What's your salary? Is your salary big enough? He goes, you know what, if you do all the right things, those things are actually the most meaningless things. It's like you perform, you continue to do what you're supposed to do, things will be taken care of. Because I just got into this attitude that said, look, I'm going to do what I need to do. If you don't promote me, I'm just going to leave anyway. So it's a choice I have. It's basically if I choose to stay and somebody is not taking care of my career in terms of if you do all the right things and somebody is not watching out for you, then it just doesn't work. You're in the wrong company. I mean, I had an incredible career at Colgate, 8 years there, moved to Asia, moved to Europe, and that was what attracted me to the company. And I was the first one to volunteer. I remember the same person, the VP of the business. And when I met with him at one point, he said, would you consider going to Europe? I go, yeah, I would go to Europe. And he said, good, because I just told him you're leaving next month. And I'm like, okay, I'll just pack up and go to Europe. And that's what we ended up doing. And it was a lot of fun. We did the same thing in China. But that continued even when I joined J&J, when there was an opportunity to go to France. I'm like, okay, I'll go. Move the whole family there. But I think that was the starting point. And at Colgate, incredible. But then I think for me, I was interested in going to the healthcare space. The guy that was running the R&D group over at consumer health at Pfizer, at one point, he called me, hey, I have this job. Would you consider it? And I told him I had just moved to run the emerging market for Colgate. So I said to him, I'm going to see how that job goes, but call me in 6 months. If that job is still open, I'm happy to have a discussion. And he actually called me exactly 6 months to the date that we talked. He said, the job is still open if you wanted income. So I'm like, okay, maybe I'll go there because one, it gets me into the healthcare space. So that's how I ended up actually into Pfizer, then J&J acquiring the consumer health business. At that time, they were merging almost 3 different companies. The new acquisition, the OTC business was part of pharma. And there was a new job that they were creating, which is in this advanced tech group. Even at that point, I had a very clear discussion to say, hey, I'm happy to set it up over the next 2 years, but I need to be on the business side. And I give him a lot of credit. He did the exact same thing. After 2 years, exactly to the day, he came to me and said, you told me you want to do this job for 2 years. He's like, I have a job for you over to run the R&D, the product development group over at Oral Care. And it was just very fast moving. I don't know, it happened so fast to some extent. And it's both. I think it's almost, I don't want to say people should keep their head down and get work done, because you have to, whether you like it or not, you have to put your name in front of a lot of people. You have to manage your own career, basically. Even at J&J, just incredible mentors, whether it's Paul Stoffels and others that have been there early on in my career. And it was always almost, we talk about having sponsorship. It's just people that you don't even interact with them every day, but they've met you once and they introduced or they tell somebody else about you. Those kinds of things just are worth so much more. And that's basically what happened. So Richard D'Souza, who was the head of R&D, basically one day he called me and he said, you have to meet Paul Stoffels. And in my head, I'm like, okay, this guy's running pharma. Why would he have time for me? But Paul actually made the time. Again, his history of the work that he did in Africa, that probably resonated also more, talking about some of the situations where I grew up. And since then, he's been an incredible mentor for me. But yeah, and then after that, it was just a fast move. I was running Oral Care. In the second year, I actually was asked to go to Europe. I run the European R&D. In France, and then there was some changes happening, so that I was asked to come back. I did 6 months of just what they call franchise R&D, and then becoming the CTO at least the last 5 years of my career at J&J.
So as you look back, definitely throughout your career, you have taken chances, right? You've taken fairly risky assignments, whether it's all these international assignments that you talked about, or really challenging assignments that would have been quite difficult. So what is it that drove you to take some of these unconventional or assignments and gain really diverse experiences?
Yeah, it's funny. The simplest answer is I get bored very easily. I mean, that's the honest truth in a sense. But that's not the decision factor. It's like, it's never I'm bored, because if I get bored about something, then that's my fault, because I'm not doing enough new things to actually make the job a little bit more exciting. So I always put it back on me. But I think for me, it was always about what new things do I want to learn. When I left Colgate, they drew how I'm going to get to the CTO job if I stay. And which was crazy, because I was like about 7 years into the job at the company. But for them to say, hey, you have an opportunity here to go all the way up to the top if you stay. But my decision was never about how do I get to a VP or to a CTO. My decision was more, what am I learning in my next job? And I felt that I had done a lot of the different jobs was in that company. So going into the healthcare space was more of a factor.
Starting your own venture, coming out of the being in corporate for over 20 years, right? That's an interesting transition. Talk more about that. And also the fact that the company that you ended up founding is not just an investment firm, but it is more of an incubator. So there's definitely some thought process, and I'm sure you faced a lot of opposition trying to do it so differently. So talk a little bit about that and the why.
I was getting involved with more and more startups. I think with Paul, a lot of the discussions was in J&J, starting J Labs, the innovation centers. A lot of that has to do how I was thinking in terms of what we should do. I think if you see, even when I was at J&J, we created the external innovation team. So we're getting the whole consumer group to be much more externally focused, because the reality of it is For every incredible hires you can make, there's probably 10 other people outside the company that are very bright and they're doing some great things. I was always curious. I read a lot about startups. I used to just do a lot of things separate, looking at what's the latest technology directly in the consumer health, but also in other areas. Culturally, it's tough to change big companies. All the big CPG companies are excellent. You give them a $50 million business, they'll give you $1 billion. But you can't have them start, they can't do 0 to 50. It's that early stage, which needs to operate very differently. It needs to be nimble. It can't be a big program. So for me, I think those were the two combinations. On one side, we're not capable, and we've tried a lot of different things to try to do what small companies do. But then on the other side, also, we know small companies have a difficult time complying with regulatory, especially in healthcare, complying with some of the quality standards that big companies have. But it doesn't mean it cannot be done. And for me, I think it was more of a challenge to say, we can prove this. This is actually doable.
Yeah.
And at the beginning, everybody just said, just raise some money, make it into a fund, invest into startups. And I'm like, no, that's not me. It's like, I can't just be an investor, take other people's money, invest it, and hope somebody else does a good job. I was much more interested in being an operator. You got to get your hands dirty. You got to be able to do everything. If I'm going to create this accelerator incubator model, one, we will operate it, which means that we will hire the people. They're going to sit with us. They're going to actually do work with us. I can tell you a lot of times we intentionally don't hire people because we want either myself and others that was in Ignite, want to learn that process first before we hire somebody. But I think the key thing was for us when we started the Ignite Venture Studio, for me, there were three things. One is there's this gap between startups and big companies. So we felt that there's room to bridge it. Then if you take a step below that, we felt that the type of people we want are people that wouldn't get those opportunities. So if you look at all of our CEOs, we're already in company number 8 within the Venture Studio, in addition to some other investments that we've done. But within those 8 companies, all of our CEOs are either African-American or women. And we didn't go out of our way to say we only hire African-American or women, but more we were looking for talent that are a little bit different, a little bit unique, and that just led into the right people being in the right places, not because we said they all have to be women and minorities. So I think things like that, we're moving towards now what we call more impactful startups, which means that we're looking at the whole situation. Granted, we're focused in the beauty and consumer health, but within that, we're looking at 40 million people that have no insurance in the US. It's like, what's the access and how do we make an impact in that? Just this last couple of weeks, we've launched devices for the home, telehealth platform, mostly targeted towards Hispanics, African Americans that wouldn't be able to access those services. I think when we do some of the oral care category and skincare categories that we're launching, they're much more focused on upcycling ingredients. So things that would have been wasted, how do you actually apply them into skincare? Our oral care is all about getting rid of plastics. Because if you think about toothpaste tubes and things like that, how much of it has like significant environmental effect. So how do we actually address? We're still focused on this gap that exists because we can actually help startups, most of them, and it's about 50-50. Half of our startups are things we started from scratch. The other half are the company startups that we identified and we brought them into the studio to be part of the studio so that we're able to help them. But all of them are still addressing this gap between big companies and small companies. And by the way, we do work with most of the big CPG companies. Most of our partnerships are actually having impact beyond just getting a startup running at a good speed. I think my guess is, I think we have across our company, we have about close to 50 people. I think it's like 70% are African-American and women. It's actually, I think like 68% are women. I think it's like 75% are African-American and women. That kind of just incredible stats in terms of when you look at it. Hispanics, Asians, it's just, and seriously, any company that puts numbers and try to meet it doesn't work very well. It's
Right.
more like, do you have the right policy? Do you have the right skill set that you're looking at, which includes diversity and inclusion? If you just do that, the numbers work out on their own. And the only reason we actually realized those numbers was recently we're doing a Series A round for the studio. And one of our potential lead investors actually asked us to send them the profile of all of our employees across the companies. And we were actually surprised. I remember looking at it, we're like, wow, we actually have companies that are 100% or 90% African-American.
Yeah.
Because they are serving that community. So to match who you're serving, and the people that are running those companies need to be consistent with that.
Right.
But it's a very exciting space. We love what we do.
And you have a really interesting collaboration with the African diaspora, right? On the telehealth platform for Africa. That sounds really interesting.
So I've been involved with the African Diaspora Network, and actually just this year, and I think in January, became the chairman of their board. And as part of that, we had started a telehealth because we have a telehealth platform that we just launched, was in the studio. And we felt that we need to start thinking about startups, because the only way, especially with COVID, to overcome the infrastructure issues in some parts of Africa is actually to use technology.
Right.
And we actually feel that we worked with the Gates Foundation. We got a grant from Gates Foundation. And soon we'll be announcing actually quite a few other big healthcare companies, consumer health companies are participating in this telehealth pilot. And the idea is basically two things that we wanted to accomplish. One, we're looking to mobilize the whole healthcare system. That there's a lot of African physicians, nurses, healthcare professionals that actually don't live in the continent. So how do we mobilize them to be almost a support mechanism to a lot of healthcare works that are already in the continent? So how do you provide that kind of a support, and how do you leverage technology? The second part of it is, then how do we help startups to start thinking about the infrastructure that needs to be built? And in that case, we're actually willing to give them the platforms that we have here in the US. So we're going to be matching some of the work we're doing in the US, finding the right startup in Africa and just connecting that. But it's been an incredible partnership, and I think we're very excited. The pilot that we're doing now will continue, and then the point is going to be to scale it. So we'll probably test it in two countries in Africa, and then scale to all the rest of Africa.
That's wonderful. More power to you. That sounds like a really much needed innovation. So one of the things that came out in almost all of the examples that you shared is really the idea of mindful leadership, right? It's about when you're tasked with a large transformation, when you're tasked with change, when you're tasked with progress, you can't do it without breaking a few things, which effectively means that you have to question existing paradigms. You have to question status quo and do things differently. So can you talk about perhaps an example of, where you've had a career full of it. So is there a specific example that stands out in your mind?
Yeah.
Where you had to really sort of take a step back and say, wait, why have we been doing it the same way for years? Why can't we do it differently? And sort of reimagining that in a way that has added value to the organization and to the people.
The organizations transform when they get in trouble. It's usually something is not working, or like there's cost improvement. Something is always triggering those things, versus constantly transforming organizations because time is changing, technology is changing. So you almost have to have a mindset that in good times or bad times, you constantly have to just think about, what do I need to upgrade? What do I need to transform? I personally think that none of it works if you don't have the right people around you. Do we have the right people? Are we hiring the right people? Are we getting the right skill set? And this is probably when I was at Colgate, their recruiting process was very unique. So we would all come in from different universities. They would do university recruiting. And in any project, there would be like somebody that's a biologist, a chemist, a mathematician, just random people in the same room. And you would go, why do they have that person here? And then you realize it's like, wow, actually, they're bringing diversity in a very different way. Because everybody assumes like diversity has to be, it's just so many African Americans or Blacks, Hispanics. It's not the best way. I think it's, by the way, there's also the root causes that need to be addressed. I think even some of the companies, when they say we need to have more diversity and inclusion, and then you go recruit like the Black person you could find or the Hispanic person you could find, by the way, 2 years later, they're gone. And
Right.
it just shows you that you don't have the right systems, you don't have the right mechanism. And even if you get them in, if the rest of the organization doesn't look like them, why would they stay? It's like, do they see a path? Do they see themselves as being part of that system? Take not just one step back to see what's going, almost 10 steps back to say, okay, what are some of the things that need to be fundamentally changed? And what are some of the things that you need to do that are just incremental? But most of the time, it has to be transformational. It has to be significant change for it to have an impact. I never held project reviews, for example, where you sit in a room, all the junior scientists have to present to you. Might as well just go into the lab where they're very open to tell you what they're doing, and you could see it in terms of how excited are they versus spending weeks trying to prepare a deck. And it's actually very interesting because it applies to what we're doing. We have this like 0 deck internally rule. There's no presentation. You want to talk, half an hour on the calendar, you talk. But don't show me like presentations and stuff. It's funny that once in a while when we deal with some of the bigger companies, they're like, okay, do you have a presentation to send us a week ahead of time? I'm like, well, you probably get it the day before, because usually we don't do presentations. We can send you a bullet points of what we're going to talk to you about. But it's really interesting that you forget how much waste time is incorporated in there just to make someone happy or to show off what you're doing, versus turning the whole organization to be much more about conversations and more meaningful and mindful conversations that actually will have a lot more impact. For me, I think exactly what you're talking about, this mindful, thoughtful way to have a discussion, to have a conversation. When I came back from Europe, I actually did this program where we asked everybody 2 questions. What is their career aspiration? And what were they told by their manager? So every manager had to sit with their people basically and tell them how they see them. So the managers never saw what they gave me, but they had to have this discussion just to see if it matches. It was interesting to see how many discrepancies. About 50% of them were different than what we even discussed like a few weeks ago, where we say this person has a potential to reach this person has been doing great in this area. But then when you hear it, it's just whenever it's, even sometimes like when it's a good news, it's never told the right way. And it could just be a bias from a manager. I think this idea of thoughtful, mindful approach to conversation is probably what lacks most of the time, because there's a structured guideline or a structured system that people are supposed to follow. It's twice a year or 3 times a year. You just have that conversation versus doing it every opportunity you get throughout the year. It makes a big difference. I personally, that worked really well for everything I've done.
That is so true. Actually, last year we conducted a number of listening labs where we invited people from all walks of life to come and talk to us about their lived experiences at work. And as you can imagine, one of the topics certainly that came up was leadership. And people talked about the kind of leaders that help them blossom and the kind that don't. And transparency, right, about knowing where you stand was such a critical piece. But it was interesting how difficult it is to find truly transparent leaders who will tell you things as they are. Then it gives you the choice or the option of figuring out whether this is where your career should be built or whether you want to do things differently and do it elsewhere.
I look at it from the outside, and still even looking at people that are in different companies I've worked for, how much people learn to undervalue what their strength is and what they can do. And by the way, there's no right or wrong answer. If a big company is where you need to be, that's perfect. But you need to know what you bring to the table, and you should be confident about it, that, hey, this is not a one-way system where you should be glad that a company hired you. I think the company needs to be very glad that they have you, because you're doing incredible things. But I think we miss that point a lot of times. A team is not going to just pick you because they need to be nice. They pick you because you're going to give them results, and it goes both ways.
Yeah. And I think as you talked about your career, you talked about a lot of leaders who had taken a chance on you, right? Who had supported you and who had really sort of fueled your career by giving you these opportunities that may not otherwise have come through. So leaders play such an important role in being
Yeah.
able to connect talent to opportunity and make sure that there is, a career path that evolves,
Yes.
because it's certainly we own our career paths ourselves, but it is also our leader who sort of partners with us on the journey in most cases.
Well, I think I think that's a very good point. I've been told for certain jobs, like, I don't think you're ready for this. That's always a mistake, to tell somebody that you're not ready for something because you've never seen them do what the possibilities are when you put them into those situations. So I tend to more focus on, you need to put people into jobs before they're ready. Just put the right support system. When I became the CTO for J&J Consumer, they were recruiting outside, and I was not part of that discussion at that time. But I was always very clear that my measurement, not just for what I'm doing, what I'm learning myself, but also the person I work for, am I going to learn something from them? So I remember being asked, somebody actually at J&J saying, hey, what would you do if we brought somebody from outside? And I said, it depends who that person is. If it's somebody that I can learn from, then I don't have any issue. If it's somebody that I think should not be in that job, then I'm not going to say that person should not be in the job, because that's a choice. But I won't be in the company. So it's something I control. And it's interesting. But then later on, I found out, after I got the job, I found out that 3 people, actually 2 of them were my bosses before. They actually went to the person at J&J that was the head, that was making that decision, saying, we would rather have Josh in that job than somebody else from outside. So it was very telling. And those are probably people I would have said, why would they want me to be their boss? Because I've worked for them. But it also says a lot about those types of leaders that actually would say, you know what, I don't have any issue for working for somebody that worked for me before.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think the piece that you talked about, about people being ready or not for a job, there's also this whole, how do you get people ready?
Yes.
And I remember the work that you and I did around,
Yes.
having this task force come together to really address a significant challenge in the organization. And they were cross-functional, they were cross-age groups, they were cross-gender. We had people from different races, we had people from different regions, different ethnicities, all coming together because they each brought something unique to the table as far as, creating that, project that we were really talking about.
Yeah.
It's interesting how, diversity truly makes a difference in terms of the end product of what that team was able to come up with.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think it's interesting, but I think people also have to be, I'm not a big fan of people that just measure how many diverse candidates I have in my organization, because it's more, it depends what levels, it depends what they're doing, how much impact are they having. All of that, I think, becomes a factor. But also then it's more like, are you surrounding them with the right tasks, the right projects, the right things to learning process that you need to put. I think all of that just becomes a big factor. And as difficult as it is in big companies, there's nobody that has more resources to do it right than big companies. So it's more, is this in your DNA or not? Is this, or do you want it to be in your DNA or not? Not like just plain stats where you just measure numbers. So I think the sustainable approach, which is addressing the root causes really early on, making it part of the system than just like a program, is probably at the core of what would work.
And I think the point that you're making, this is not about hiring a diverse candidate for a job. It's about hiring the best candidate for a job. But often what happens is that because of the way our systems are, if we are not questioning why we are hiring from the same talent pool, why we are hiring, with the same job descriptions that we have used for years, why we are sort of, positioning roles a certain way, why we are looking at locations the same way that we have always looked at. If we are not questioning those fundamental things, we are not creating a level
Yeah.
playing field for talent from different walks of life to be actually interested in
Yeah.
us and in the
But
role we have.
yeah, I completely agree. And it's actually more fun now, based on what I do now. It's funny. Some of our people, just to give you an example, one of our people here in Pennsylvania, her daughter was going to Purdue University in Indiana. And I'm like, why are you staying in Pennsylvania? Why don't you just move to Indiana so you're closer to your daughter and just work from there? And actually, that's what they ended up doing. So we're getting into this habit now. It's like, hey, whatever you're comfortable with, I would rather see you be close to where you want to be and be like 100% focused on that. And it's funny that today, actually, we don't even have an office. It's like, which is interesting. Everybody's like, where's your office? Can we come see it? I'm like, yeah, it's the Princeton Library, the public library. That's where our office is. So we just meet wherever we can. The more you allow your people to do their best job, because whatever their situation is, and addressing that is actually much more important than just trying to get everybody to almost follow the same path. It's a good friend of ours who's in Israel now was telling me this company is trying to get everybody, but there's a talent war, so they don't want to lose anyone. So every Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, when they want them to come in, they bring all kinds of food and everything else. And I'm like, I don't think anybody is going to drive to work just because you gave them some food.
Definitely hit on one of my favorite topics as well, and all of the craziness surrounding it at this point. And you talked actually about, how your organization pivoted during the pandemic. And the fact that you actually launched so many new companies in the pandemic without ever having met the founders in person. So talk a little bit about, what that pivot was like for you during the pandemic, from being in person to going fully remote, and then get to a whole new level.
I think we became extremely productive because we got into a very simple system that says, okay, no more meetings in person. Everybody will work remote wherever they are, wherever they feel comfortable with. But with that said, there's very clear deliverables that everybody has to touch base on. It's like, we're going to do X, Y, Z. And then each group basically sets the time. It's half-hour meetings. You know what was the most surprising about that? All of our CEOs, all of our senior people, like the chief marketing officers, COOs, and others that we have in the companies, somehow they all started to get together every week. And they would have a call. Yeah, without us. And they basically discuss what's working in their business, what's happening. But also, there was an incentive we gave people, because everybody, regardless of what they're running, if any company that we start in the studio, everybody has ownership in the studio, not just the company that they have. So that forces everybody to say, you know what, I might be taking a risk in my company because I'm running a company now, but I also have ownership into the 8 other companies that actually are in the portfolio. So that gave everybody incentive that, hey, if I can, even if I'm having a tough time in my company, as long as that company is actually, the other company is doing well, I'm still going to be successful with it. So for us, I think that plays a big factor, because we tend to focus a lot more on incentives that actually makes people ownership, that allows them to feel like, I am part of it, not because you work there, but more you have real ownership, you're vested into it. And by the way, if any of the 8 people that are running companies are successful, you're getting something from it. When we started, we were very traditional in a way, all of us coming from big companies. There was like salary structures and things like that, bonus structures and stuff. After a year, we actually moved during COVID, where we let people choose. Are you the risk taker or not? So we actually created even a compensation structure. It's tiered, where you could choose a high salary, low ownership, or low rewards later on, or a low salary, but then a significant upside as the company progresses. And we let them choose. So it's like, this is not, we're trying to pigeonhole you into one, because everybody's risk profile is different. So those kinds of things have been extremely helpful, because, hey, you're making that decision yourself. It also gives us in terms of how you see what you're doing, because if you're worried about being in a startup, but then you have a family, you have certain things to worry. By the way, I mean, most of our salaries are very competitive. We're able to work with each one of them. But simple things like that during COVID actually helped us readjust a lot of our approach. But I have to say, COVID, at least our venture studio, it made us extremely productive.
I think one of the pieces that resonates with me about the example that you shared on compensation is it is unique because it is not a one-size-fits-all solution. One of the things I think that we are discovering, certainly through the pandemic, through our listening labs, from what we are hearing from people, but also the over 12 months of research that we have done now, is that people want to be treated as individuals because each person has very unique needs that define what their requirements are from a job. And to have one size fits all solution doesn't fit actually anyone because you build for averages and it actually doesn't meet anyone's needs. And so one size fits all actually fits no one. We're taking a completely different turn in terms of trying to do something different with compensation.
It's actually very interesting to have those open discussions with people, getting a very complete view of how they see their job. But I agree with you that I think it's a big challenge because we always had like a range of salaries. Everybody in this position has to be in this, regardless of what their situation and what they're willing to do. So almost it doesn't have to be to the startup level, but there's an in-between area where you can personalize a few things. In the whole world, everything is moving to personalization anyway, and I don't know why salaries and jobs and everything else should not be that kind of personalization based on what your need is, based on your family situation, your location. All of that should be a factor in deciding how your job is going to be defined.
Let's pivot a little bit to mindful inclusion. You were actually the first person that I called when we had, sort of developed our solution now, and I wanted to get your thoughts then. And, you saying that we're onto something really meant a lot. I think it really took us a long way after that. And so I'd love to know from an inclusion perspective, right? As you look back at your career, when have you felt completely included, immersed, part of something, big, and how did that impact you? As well as what did you learn from it? And also the reverse, right? When did you not included? And, how did that impact you and what you learned from it? So if you have examples that you can share, would love to hear.
On the inclusion piece, when I think it was actually maybe my third year, fourth year straight out of school working at Colgate, I was actually part of a leadership program that they had, that I was selected. And it was very interesting because that was just very early in my career. I was selected to represent R&D. It's people coming from around the world, I'm still friends with some of the people that participated in that program. That was like 20 years ago. We're meeting with the CEO of the company. We had a lot of different programs. I personally think that to this day, I hold incredible view of Colgate because of that program. I felt like they were very open to say, hey, if you want to reach here, this is the things we expect from you. Including at that time, the CEO of the company sitting with us and just saying, hey, if you need to make some decisions where you want to be, but at the same time, this is not like somebody's not going to hand you all of this. So you need to show results. You need to perform. All of that, I think, was just very, it shaped everything. That's on top of somebody showing you all the strategy for the company, just walking you through everything that they're doing. I think it just helps people rethink why they're there. It gets them much closer. The exclusion piece, seriously, like even I would say when there was some decisions being made for the CTO role, I probably would have left the company at that time because not being included in a lot of the discussions, and not because it was less important for me to be selected for that job, but more being aware, what is the decision process? What are you doing and why? Not knowing any of that, I was just almost like prepared to say, hey, if this doesn't happen because nobody gave me any information, I was willing to walk away, basically. It doesn't have to be that drastic, but it is almost, because if you felt excluded from certain things, there's just no way you should be staying in that kind of a situation regardless of what the outcome is. So yeah, it works both ways. A lot of times you might put it into yourself to say, hey, I should go and ask the questions, like, why am I not being considered for this or that? You got nothing to lose asking those questions.
Right.
But at the same time, if you are intentionally excluded, or if somebody just didn't want you to be part of it, you have to ask yourself to say, am I in the right place?
So there are so many more questions, but clearly, we can talk forever. So what we did is we created this segment of rapid fire.
Okay.
Questions,
Uh-oh.
and you can get your quick responses, to some of these topics, right?
Yeah.
So ready?
Sure.
Okay. What was the first job you ever had?
My first real job was actually at McDonald's.
Ah,
Yeah. So we moved to US. It was weird because we moved in April. College doesn't start till August. And I didn't have a car. So we're like, okay, what can I work that I can walk to? So there was a McDonald's about a mile and a half from our house. So I worked at McDonald's. That was my first job.
that's the benefit of McDonald's in every corner.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's go to the second one. How many languages do you speak? And what's one language that you've always wanted to learn?
Yeah, I probably do 4 or 5 of them because some of them come and go because if I don't practice. The one language that I wish I had spent more time is actually French. We go there every summer. By the way, both my kids are both learning French. They've been taking it since they were kids because we moved them as part of a J&J job when they were 2 and 4. We lived in France. So for some reason they picked it up and they're still taking it in school every year. And then, as you know, some of our friends from France, every time I see them,
They'll see this and they'll teach you.
Yes.
Thinking of all the people that you've learned from, and you talked about mentors and sponsors, who's the most unlikely person outside of your professional circle who you've learned from?
I'm going to say a group of people, which are either people I played with soccer or I coach in soccer, are the people I learned the most. Because there's, in some cases, it's just tactics, everybody contributing. I remember at one point when I was at University of Illinois, we were coaching the women's soccer, just as an example. I know this is rapid fire, but to explain it, we were playing University of Michigan, and one of my players came in and said, hey, did you notice what that defender is doing? We should be switching the 2 players. And we did that. The game was like in control. The reason I use that as an example is, how do you empower people to actually come and say, hey, we need to notice this or that, so that then you see that things calm down right after that?
So that's a great segue to my next question, which is there one thing that you think you've learned from your team? Because most of these, you certainly learn from, your mentors or head coaches and others, but these are interesting examples that you're giving of actually learning from the team, even when you are the coach. And so is there a work example that you have of something that you learned from the team?
Yeah, there's quite a bit actually, because I've been lucky enough that in most of the teams that have been around me are mostly people I selected. And they're not afraid to tell me what's going on, or if something, as you know, how many times have we been in dinner and somebody would say, why do we have to do this, or why do we have to do that? So for me, I think I'm a big believer that just empower people, leave them alone. When they need help, they'll come to you. And that's how it should operate. And I think you see it most of the time, because people, the more you leave them alone, the more likely they're going to perform and actually work much better than somebody over basically being supervised all the time.
Yeah, that's a great point. Well, I think I know the answer to this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Have you had a reverse mentor, and what have you learned from them?
Oh, absolutely. I think from day one, it's like I've been one of those junior people mentoring senior people, and then my whole career has been the reverse of it, which is incredible. One thing that I always learned is almost just understanding the pulse of the organization.
Right. Next question.
Yes.
So if I were able to peek into your social media whether it's Facebook, LinkedIn, look at all your contacts, or maybe your phone, actually, that might be more interesting. Look at your phone and see how many people from how many countries would be represented?
You know, I'm picking up my phone, but probably won't be able to look at it. But anyway, I would say maybe about 90 to 100 countries. So I have a crazy list of people from everywhere. So I probably have close somewhere between 90 to 100 countries on my phone or on my LinkedIn. Now I'm curious. I'm going to go back and do the calculation. I don't do Facebook or any other stuff, but I live on LinkedIn. But LinkedIn is probably close to that.
Next question. If your life story was made into a movie, what would
Oh, this is a tough. There's two songs that come. I'll do the simple one, which is One Republic called "I Lived," and then the other part of it, Eminem's "I'm Not Afraid." It's completely opposite in a sense that his is basically saying, yeah, it's like don't be afraid to take the steps that you need to. So those two probably would be at the top of my list.
What is one piece of advice that you think has helped you in your career? And what's one piece of advice that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Yeah. The one advice that helped my career is basically early on, seriously, my first year in the industry, somebody telling me focus on performance. Deliver. It's not what you pick, but when somebody assigns you an assignment, if you're going to do something, it's almost like I do it with my kids also. If you say you're going to do something, do it, whether it might not work, but at least you've tried to do it. And then just focusing on your performance. It's like if you continue to deliver, that fixes everything. What was the second question? It's like, what advice would I give?
Yeah.
You know, and it's a two-part. One is make sure you're surrounded with the right people. But as you do that, also then using this lens of what's the worst thing that could happen should always be the way to measure things. And by that, I mean, what's the worst thing that could happen? It's like, hey, something will fail. And by the way, we'll come up with a different plan to do it. Then experiment, play around, test your way into it, as long as you think it's going to give you a bigger outcome, but half the time it might not work. So those would be the two things.
Wonderful. Thank you, Josh. This has been an absolute pleasure. And, thank you so much for coming and spending time with us today.
No, it's great catching up. It's been a while, so it's great. And yeah, I'm very excited where you take this mindful leadership. I think there's just an incredible, at minimum, it's going to make people think, it's like, how am I making decisions? I think this whole idea that we talked about, is it just to make a decision for the sake of decision, or it's a very thoughtful that has a long-term impact? I think I'm excited to see what you do with this.
Thank you.
Excellent.